on all afternoon, so I don't have any structured schedule for that, so we'll just see how it goes, and we'll see how it ends. So, before I go into the details of sort of protocol analysis, a lot of people might know I often say that if you use a protocol analyzer correctly, it's a little bit like having a magic wand. Okay. Now, you all saw me demonstrate my built-in analyzer at the beginning of today. And for some people came up to me and said, how did I do it? Well, I did it using my built-in analyzer, which is why I say an analyzer can be like a magic wand. And it's not just doing magic that people come up and go, how did you do that? Sometimes you get that when doing protocol analysis as well. So I spend quite a bit of my time being booked as a consultant to do troubleshooting and analysis, and sometimes when people call me in to do some protocol analysis, they're not going to, like, the minute they have a problem, they don't, hey, I know, well, let's phone Peter. It's not how the world works. You're going to first of all use the tools you have available. So if you've got Mist, you're going to maybe use a Mist dashboard to try and answer your problem. You're going to use maybe network monitoring solutions you've got. You could ask Marvitz and he may well get the answer. So many problems don't actually need us to do protocol analysis and packet analysis. But when all those tools fail, when they don't give you the answer that you need, it's at that point generally people phone me up and I might go in and do some protocol analysis. And if a company's had a problem for 4 months, 6 months, and then I come in with my analyzer and within 24 hours I've analysed the packets, told them what the problem is, and left, the question I often get asked is, how did you do that? So if you use the tools you have available to you correctly, it can a little bit be like performing magic tricks. So that's what I want to try and show you today. We're going to go through, I've got a few different examples and we'll try and go through them. But look at some different trace files and try and show you how do I do that. First of all though, here's a picture. I don't know what you see when you look at this picture. Maybe you see an owl staring at you, a barn owl. Or maybe you just see a cup of coffee with 2 hula hoops in the middle of them, which is actually what it's a picture of. But it looks a bit like an owl. What about this picture? This is a picture I'm sure many people have seen before, but what do you see when you look at it? Do you see a skull, or do you see 2 girls playing with a dog? It all depends how we look at it. And then finally this one. Some people when they look at this will see an old woman, and other people will see quite a young woman. It all depends how you look at it and which perspective you look at. It's all to do with, for those people, is whether this is the mouth of the old woman down here, or this is the eye and the nose of the young woman looking over her shoulder. You can view it in one of 2 ways. So I wonder, when we look at something, it's how we interpret it that's important. I wonder what you see when you look at this picture. Here's another one for you. I wonder what you see when you see this picture. Do you just see a whole bunch of data and information that makes no sense at all? Well, we've got some WAP encrypted data apparently there. Yeah, it doesn't really mean anything else to you. Or do you see a misbehaving access point with a firmware bug? Let's look more closely at it, and let me try and show you what I mean. Here's a zoomed in section from this same sample. Now, at first, you might go, well, I still just see a load of WAP encrypted data. This was taken from a retail warehouse where they were still using WEP. Yes, believe it or not, some people still do. And we can see that there's a source and a destination. But the interesting thing is in the flags column, that little plus tells me it's a retransmission. So what I'm looking at here is a data packet transmitted and then see it retried several times before eventually getting an acknowledgement. Now, the interesting column and where we see the issue is this data rate column. What we see is we see it originally being sent at 36 megabits per second, and it'll retry it, then it drops to 18, retries it twice at 18, then it drops to 12, and keeps going all the way down here. And what we actually see here is actually the thing being acknowledged is actually this null data packet. It's not the data itself, and then the data then keeps getting retransmitted and retransmitted. Now on this network, the data kept being retransmitted and never ever got acknowledged. So what was the issue here? Well, when we look at packets being sent by the down here, we can see there's some being sent at 2 meg, these acknowledgements. And what was happening on this network was every time the client transmitted, it was transmitting at 1 or 2 megabits per second, sometimes 5 megabits per second. And any time the AP transmitted a frame, this one at 11 meg, you got an ACK. But when it was being sent at higher data rates, you didn't. And this problem was occurring inside a freezer. Now, I don't know if anyone's been in walk-in freezers before, but they're big metal boxes you can basically walk into. When I was actually asked to troubleshoot this issue, it was quite funny because what was happening in the activity that was happening in the freezers is they'd be scanning products and then they would try and print a label to a printer from the scanner. And sometimes they couldn't print the labels. Now, in this freezer, it was about minus 22 degrees Celsius. So it was quite cold, one of the most cold places I've had to troubleshoot. So I sat by this printer in its like big snowsuit with my laptop going, first person came along with, did it print? Yes, it did. Okay, next person. Did it print? Yes. And eventually one didn't print. I was like, brilliant. I've got the data I want and off and I'm out. And then I came to analysing the data. But what was happening, and what was interesting about it was, if you've ever been in a freezer, the high multipath environment, so you get lots and lots of reflections. All those reflections corrupt the signal. And what does that mean by corrupting the signal? Well, it corrupts the signal so we can't use very high data rates. We have to drop to a low modulation level. And inside the freezer, the clients could only really use 802.11b data rates. Any modulation above that was just too hard for it to be able to decode. Now, when this problem occurred, they just updated the Wi-Fi APs. And what the Wi-Fi APs were doing were going down to 12 meg, but never going any lower. So they were dynamic rate shifting down to 12 megabits per second and then stopping. And then they would try again and jump back up to 36 meg. The clients couldn't communicate at 12 meg. It was still too high. It needed to go down to at least 11 meg. And the APs weren't, for some reason, on the version of code they were never transmitting below 12 meg. What we did was we re-backed off the firmware change. The AP started dynamic rate shifting down all the way down, and the client started working again. So this was a great example of how we can sort of use a protocol analyzer to see this unusual behaviour. Actually, in freezers, I've often disabled the high data rates. And if you disable the high data rates, it stops the client and the APs having to dynamic rate shift down all the time. Because if they can only use low data rates, only have your low data rates enabled. It's one of the few places you may disable high data rates as opposed to disabling the low data rates. So that's one example of how when we can start to look at these trace files and data, we can start to see data in them and details. The other thing I want to quickly chat about is capture locations. Where do we capture data? Every time I go in and do some troubleshooting, I'm not just capturing at the wireless side of it. Sure enough, I want to get a wireless capture from the client perspective. So very often, I'm going to use dongles such as these plugged into my laptop, and I'm going to do some wireless packet capture. But I may also want to get captures from the AP perspective. This is where the missed APs are really useful because of the dynamic packet capture and also the fact you can trigger a manual packet capture. It's very easy to get data from the AP itself, which is sometimes another perspective of where we want to look at data. Sometimes we want to look at data on the wired side of the AP as well. What's going back and forward from its Ethernet port, and that's the example I'm going to show you next. But just to complete the picture, sometimes you want to capture all wireless frames, all traffic going to from all APs. So if there's a controller or a wireless VLAN on a switch you can mirror, then you can capture all Wi-Fi traffic, which can sometimes be useful as well. Sometimes there's an actual application server that your clients are talking back to, and you could mirror a port going to an application server. I'm also going to show you an example with an application server during its time as well, if we have time anyway. So we can capture data at lots of different places, and by doing that allows us to see a full picture of what we want to see. So let's talk about a common problem, and this is what I saw at the customer. We've got a user here who is, if you ask him what's the Wi-Fi like, the Wi-Fi is rubbish here. Here is a rubbish place for Wi-Fi. But look, there's the access point. So this I don't know if you've ever seen it, where people complain about the Wi-Fi being terrible, but actually you look and they're in a really good place for Wi-Fi. Now, so this example was the users were actually getting limited connectivity. Now, and you know what that means when they're basically not getting an IP address. So we looked at the user's machine who was saying the Wi-Fi was terrible, and they had a little explanation mark, and it was saying the connection was limited connectivity, as in they weren't getting an IP address. So the interesting thing was some users said the Wi-Fi was fine. So sometimes some users were getting on, they were getting IP addresses and they were connecting fine. Others were having intermittent problems. Sometimes the issue only occurred when they roamed from one AP to another. So it seemed to be random who it affected and when it was affecting them. Sometimes it affected users when they first connected, sometimes it's when they moved from one AP to another. And the solution was to disable the wireless card, re-enable it, and very often it worked, but sometimes it didn't. So it's a very random solution. So how did we go about troubleshooting the issue? We checked the DHCP scope. Were they just out of IP addresses? And they weren't. They had plenty of IP addresses in the DHCP scope. So what issue were they having? Well, this was the case. We decided to capture all the wired traffic going to and from the AP, as well as capturing wireless frames. Now, when we look at the wireless connectivity, well, was it the fact that the client just couldn't connect? Well, what we can see here is there's some authentication frames, so they go through what we call open system authentication. They then associate request and response to the AP. This was used in 802.1x. It was a corporate network, so we see an EAP exchange. We see an EAP success, which indicates the user successfully authenticated to the network. And we see the four-way handshake, so they've exchanged encryption keys. Then we see a whole load of encrypted data. So this user has connected to the network absolutely fine. They've exchanged keys, they've authenticated. As far as I can tell from a wireless capture, everything is good. But the user's complaining that they don't have any network connectivity. But from a Wi-Fi perspective, they've connected okay. And after this point, I've just got encrypted data frames. I can decode them. It's an 802.1x network. So let's have a look at our AP capture. The capture from the wired port of the AP. That's something I'm going to show you inside of OmniPeak.
So while you do it, what are the main differences between Wireshark, which is free, and OmniPeak, which costs money? Like when people are choosing their analyzer of choice, you use OmniPeak.
I use OmniPeak. I've used OmniPeak for 20 years plus, so it's an analyzer I'm comfortable with. I do use Wireshark sometimes as well. I think Wireshark's a little bit more difficult to use. If you want, to some extent, you pay for what you get, but if you want a tool that's quick and easy to use, I find OmniPeak a bit quicker. So the filtering, the being able to dynamically colour things on the fly without having to know the syntax for typing in filters, which you do with Wireshark, it's just a bit quicker from my point of view. And when I'm got the pressure on and I'm trying to solve a problem on site, I want a tool I can use and filter and get to the traffic I want quickly. I find with Wireshark you can do it, but it just takes a little bit more time. I also prefer how OmniPeak presents the data. So one thing, and the main bit of data I prefer how it presents, because the actual packet view you can put colouring rules in. But it's actually the decode screen in OmniPeak I like the most, which uses different colours. So the text is not just black and white. Again, it helps me just to identify and see things really quickly. So it uses red for the field name, black for the value, and it's olive green colour for the interpretive text. So I'm not having to just read for me, just all the black and white text. It gets a bit jumbled up. Is that a field? Is that the value? Is that what it's trying to tell me? So you've got to read, I think, Wireshark a bit more carefully. So it's fine. It's a good tool, is Wireshark. It just takes a bit more time to interpret what you're seeing. That's how I would view it. So let's look at this AP capture. This was the capture I got, and we particularly have filtered, because we weren't getting an IP address, just on DHCP packets. And we can see a whole bunch of DHCP packets. Not particularly of a lot of interest at the moment. Let me just turn off that decode line. And in the summary column, it's going to tell me, it tells me whether it's an inform, a discover, a request, an acknowledge. There's a whole bunch of different data. So we were capturing behind this AP, and we had some clients trying to connect. And then finally one had this issue, they had the problem. So if I scroll down and find that client, now I happen to know which client it was, so I can discover it quite quickly. I'm just going to... Now the client having the issue was this Intel 6C928B client. So I found the client, and I know this is the user that's having the issue. So let's see if we can troubleshoot the issue altogether and figure out what it was. Now, I'm going to zoom in a bit just so you guys can see what I can see, especially the ones at the back. So here we can see the client's request, and it's requesting, can I have the IP address I had before? So it's 10.140.33.1. And the response comes back, NAC. Negative acknowledgement. No, you can't. So the DHCP server is refusing the request for an IP address. Why is that? Why would the DHCP server refuse it? In fact, because some clients are working, and if we look above, we can see there's plenty of ACKs to other addresses. Here's one, here's a different client requesting an IP address in the same subnet, and it gets an ACK back. So why is the client getting a negative acknowledgement? How can we explain it, and how would we go around troubleshooting it? Well, the devil is always in the detail in analysis. So if we have a look at the decode for this negative acknowledgement, there's a whole load of information in the DHCP protocol that we can look at. There's the negative acknowledgement. It's coming back from this server address 10.104.32.1. Well, that's interesting. I now know what the DHCP server is that's answering. So any interesting information when I'm comparing something that worked and something that didn't, I often like to put as a column within inside the tool. So if I right click on it and say add as decode column, and then we go back to our decode, we're going to have a new column here. Just need to scroll across to it. And it's the server IP address. Now, what's interesting here is we can see the NAC, and we can see it requests it again and has another NAC, and it comes from its 10.104.32.1. But look at the one that works up here with the ACK, 10.104.32.2. The ones that work seem to get a response from a different DHCP server than the one that didn't work. So the first thing, I'm then going back to the customer and asking, what is the IP address of your DHCP server? And they say, oh, it's 10.104.32.2. Okay, so what is 10.104.32.1? And they went, oh, let's have a look. Had some tapping, and they came in and said, that's our core switch. So why is your core switch answering DHCP requests? Oh, we don't know, it shouldn't be. So I literally on a WebEx get them to bring up the core switch interface, and I said, do you have a DHCP helper function enabled on that? No, I don't think we do. And then we do a show running config and find out that they do have a DHCP helper function going off to some other DHCP server which doesn't have this subnet in its scope. So what was happening was sometimes with DHCP, when you do a discover message or request, they're all broadcast. And they're broadcast messages because you haven't got an IP address. So you can unicast them, you've got to broadcast it out. And whoever responds first is the response you take. So sometimes the core switch was responding before the DHCP server, and it was going, no, you can't connect. Sometimes the real DHCP server was responding, going, yes, okay. And this was why it was random. Some people getting an IP address, some people not. It just depended who responded first. And we disabled the DHCP helper function eventually, and the network started working. I say eventually because when I said, can you just disable that, they went, we'll have to raise a change for that. And then there was a big long debate about whether that's something they could turn off or not, even though it was causing half their users not to be able to connect to the network. It was still debated for many hours, but that's how we came to the conclusion of that issue. Okay, let's have a look at some other examples then. What about voice traffic? I find voice traffic an interesting thing to troubleshoot and analyze. And I want to show you how using an analyzer you can actually start to troubleshoot voice traffic. There's a lot of information there which might not first initially seem obvious when we talk about troubleshooting voice. So I'm going to work through two examples of you. I was working in a customer, their voice was really important to them. They were a legal firm, and their entire office was Wi-Fi only. They had no wires, no Ethernet ports on any desks. All their no phones on any desks. It was all Skype for business through the laptop. So it was a completely wireless environment. And we were doing some troubleshooting of some of their voice issues they were having through Skype for business. And I'll show you this little trace file here. Now, when you first start capturing data, this is a corporate network using 802.1x. So there's not a huge amount of decoding I can do. When I look at the traffic here, what do we see? A load of encrypted data and acknowledgements. And you might think, well, is protocol analysis really any good for troubleshooting voice traffic? So what can I tell? I can see that it's VoIP client, you know, I've put it in my name table so it displays in blue, and I can see a bunch of encrypted data frames. I don't know whether he's having any problems or what the difficulty is. What can you tell from that? Okay, I can look at the signal strength, I can look at the data rate column, but I don't really know where else to start. Well, let me show you a few tips for troubleshooting voice and how we troubleshoot it. First of all, if we realise, as we can see, that most of the data frames have been acknowledged, it looks like flow is going quite well. If we just want to look at the sort of voice packets, one thing we can do is just select the encrypted data frames only. So get rid of all the other management frames that are on there. So if I pick a packet, and this is something I quite like with OmniPeak that I can do, is I can select a packet and I can say, select related packets by protocol. That's just going to select out all the encrypted data frames. And I'm going to copy those to a new window. Okay, so I've got all encrypted data frames going to and from this voice client. Now, another thing that I quite like is if I open up one of these packets, inside the QoS control field of the MAC header, and don't forget, when we encrypt data, the MAC header's never encrypted, it's only the stuff afterwards. One thing we can see is the priority. So again, if I'll just quickly zoom in on that for you, you can see here it tells me the traffic is being tagged as voice. That's what we see here. So we can see the voice priority. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on that and add that as a decode column. And then I'm just going to drag, got so many other columns open here. I'm just going to drag that over so we can see it. So I can now see which frames are being tagged as voice and which aren't. And we can see, okay, there's a bit of best effort traffic. That's probably them not sending any voice, but most of the time, it's looking okay. Voice client, data traffic. Looks okay. That's what you get with voice. Every 20 milliseconds, it's sending a packet in one direction, and it's coming back. I can see it's tagged voice both directions. All is looking good. Hasn't really helped me in my analysis of what issues I might be having. Let me show you another trick. If I go, at the moment I've got like the protocol column coloured, the colour of the protocol, the clients and voice coloured. One thing I can do is if I say colour by source, it now colours the entire line of every packet by who's sending it. So packets coming from my client are blue, packets going to my client are black. Now, does that help any at all? Well, let's look at this data rate column. Now I've got some colour associated with it. Let me zoom in again for you guys. All the blue packets are 130.3 megabits per second. All the black packets, they're the packets coming from the network to the client, are going at 24 megabits per second. I hadn't spotted that until I put the colours on. But just by colouring the display actually makes it a lot easier for me to see what's happening. Now, when I see a best effort packet go towards the client, oh look, 144.4. So data frames are going at a high data rate. So it's not that my access point can transmit at a high data rate, it's choosing to send voice frames at a lower data rate. And in fact, I started analysing different parts of the network, and what I realised on this network was every single access point was always sending voice frames at 24 meg. This was actually a Cisco network. I got in touch with a guy from Cisco I know, Jerome, and he said, no, it shouldn't be doing that. which was good to know, because I thought, oh, well, maybe it's choosing to do that because it's a robust data rate, but apparently it shouldn't be doing it. And then in the end, we found a bug with the particular code version they had, where it was sending voice frames at a low data rate and not the highest it could. But do you see how by just slightly tuning the display, actually these problems jump out much more clearly than they would if we were just looking at the data. Let's look at another voice example, and we'll do the exact same thing, but this time we're going to discover another problem that's different from the first one. So, here's another voice conversation. This was a voice call between two laptops. It was in the same office environment. This was in another location where they were particularly having a lot of voice problems. We'd fixed the initial problem, the 24 meg one, so we're now back to looking at another issue. Now, again, I'm going to go through the same process. So I'm going to take all the encrypted data frames, I'm going to select related, and I'm going to do it by protocol, copy to a new window. And we see that we've got data flowing between two voice phones, going backwards and forwards. There's a bit of other data here as well. But this time, you can see traffic going from voice phone 1 to voice phone 2, which was, we were actually monitoring the wireless comms at voice phone 2. So voice phone 1 was coming via the wired network. And if we look at the course control frame, it's been marked as batch effort. But the voice traffic going back up, all the green packets are marked at voice. Okay, let me zoom in a bit so you guys can see that. So you can see the blue packets are batch effort, the green packets are voice. So what was happening here was the end-to-end quaz wasn't working. We were marking the voice going up to the AP as voice, but the packets coming back to us were being marked as batch effort. And what we found was quaz wasn't enabled on one of the switches connected to a group of the APs. So in this particular area where those APs were connected, quaz hadn't been enabled on the switch and the markings were being lost as the packets were flown back down towards the AP. And the quaz markings were not enabled. But you can see, hopefully, from those two examples that if we start using an analyzer and we start colorizing packets and we start creating custom columns, some of these issues are actually quite easy to find. As opposed to it just being, I've got a bunch of encrypted data packets and I don't know what to do with them. So that's some of the information we can see in a voice file. Okay. I'll show you something I mentioned in the first talk as well I did this morning, but I'll actually show you it in OmniPeak and how you can see that sort of information. So the trace file I'm opening now was taken from a distribution center. It was a really busy distribution center. There was lots of APs, very high up on the ceiling. They were all about 10 meters high. And this is a 2.4 gigahertz capture. We had cards capturing on 1, 6 and 11, so we're capturing all the packets in the environment. Most of the scanners were on 2.4 at the time. And this was an environment where we were interested what the wireless environment looked like. And there's a little tool here called Compass which allows us to look at various, that shows me all the megabits being transmitted. But I can also look at the retransmission rate. And we can see that when we look at this retransmission rate, it's fairly low for this trace file. It's not. I'm not seeing too many retransmissions. But when we look at the protocols, we can see that there's quite a lot of broadcast traffic. We can see there's 31 beacons, there's quite a few probe requests, probe responses, there's authentication traffic. Actually, when we look at the encrypted data frames that you actually retries are going to apply to, that's actually down to quite a small percentage of the total traffic on the network. So, this is an example of how statistics can sometimes be misleading, because if nearly half my traffic is all broadcast and multicast traffic, when I'm looking at this retry rate, I'm not looking at, the only things that you're going to see retries for are unicast frames. So let's go back to that protocol view, and let's just select our encrypted data. So again, we'll select packets, copy them to a new window. So what this will do is it's going to take all the data packets out of that initial trace file into their own window. Now what happens if I look at the compass again, and this time looking at retransmissions, now we can see it peaking up to 100. So there's a lot of co-channel interference and a lot of refractions in its sort of distribution center, lots of reflections, lots of co-channel interference, and what that meant was the RF environment in 2.4 was really unstable, and we were getting so many retransmissions, and it was causing lots of slow nets and lots of delays in warehouse picking operations, and it was just a really, really messy 2.4 gig environment. What we managed to do was move a lot of the handles onto 5 gig, and we saw a massive improvement. But it's just good to be able to see here that sometimes you've got to understand the statistics you're seeing when you first look at them, because initially it didn't look like we had a problem with retries, did it? But when we selected just the data frames, we actually saw that we had a big problem with retransmissions in this environment. Let's take a look at another example, and this is a bit more of a complicated problem to fix. It was in a similar environment actually. It was in a distribution centre that had quite an unstable RF environment, as we're going to see. So we could just point a finger at that environment. So let me tell you a little bit about the problem here. This was a warehouse, and they had these picking devices. I don't know if you've seen how warehouse picking works, but they were called Vocalex R720 pickers, voice pickers. And how that virtually works is you have these people who are picking products to go to different stores, and they wear a little headset, and they get given a number of a product. So it might be like 574. That might be all the dog food. So they go to 574, which is a stack of dog food, and they go 574 into the microphone, and in their ear goes, pick 6. And they pick 6, and they put 6 on the trolley, and then they say, pick 6, and then it'll say 248, which might be bananas. And then they move along with their trolley to bananas, and they get to bananas, and they say 248, and it goes pick 4, and they pick 4 bananas, and then it gives them the next number, and so on. Now, what these guys working on the warehouse floor is they have a certain pick rate, a certain amount of products they're meant to pick every hour, or at least in their shift they're meant to get through so many trolleys, and they actually get their wages. They don't get as much wages if they don't hit the pick rate. So you can imagine that's not very good when they go 524, 524, and then they just hear a beep, beep in their ear, which means that they're getting a delayed response, and they're not getting a response back. And that's what was happening in this warehouse. The devices were beeping, which means that the response was being delayed, and it was causing pick rates to go down. across the warehouse store. So that was a problem we were troubleshooting. So we set up various modes of captures. We had, I was following one of the clients around with wireless captures, capturing on every single channel they may roam to. I also had a wired capture, monitoring all the traffic going to and from the application server, which was serving the messages to and from these handhelds. Now, the way these messages work, although they speak, they actually just get, it's actually just a telnet application. So they don't actually send the voice commands just get interpreted in the handset and converted to text commands. And then it's sent, and you get text commands going backwards and forwards. So that's what the protocol looks like, which we'll see why it's important to understand in a bit. And that was the problem we were having. So let's open up, first of all, so this is the trace file from the wireless client that was having problems. Now, I've followed the client around for about 5 hours, and every time they had a delay, I was noting down the time it happened. So I knew what time it happened. I also knew the MAC address of that client who I was following around. And it was a client who was using pre-shared key, which was quite useful, so I could get the pre-shared key and decode the encrypted packets. So this is what the trace file I've just opened is actually the filtered on the MAC address of the client I was following around, and I've used a key to decrypt the traffic, so I can actually see the data, which we'll see why that's useful in a minute. So you can actually see already that there's quite a lot of retransmissions, which we're going to see in this trace file as we look at the packets. So we've got some data. Now, if I'm just going to view it by IP address. Because I've actually put the IP address of the client into my name table. You can see it's called A720 client, and also the application server is in here as well. So we can see there's conversations between the client and the application server going on all the time here. So I'm going to go to the point in time when the problem was occurring. So I'm just going to, I actually have the packet number here. So this is when the problem was occurring. I'm just going to get rid of the cross control field decode column we've added earlier, because it's not as relevant. And I'll show you guys how I did. So here we can see lots of packets coming from the client to the application server at around the time they was having a problem. Now, one thing if you know OmniPeak or whichever analyzer you use, it's good to know what flags mean. And if I double click up here and we look at the flags, we can see that a little plus means it's a retransmission. Again, we'll zoom in a bit. So the plus means a retransmission. So, and we can see lots and lots of pluses. So there's lots and lots of Wi-Fi retransmissions going on this decode. Now, if I look at this original packet, let's have a look at what was happening. So I can see that the MAC header, I can see it's coming from my Vercollect client. I can see it's going to some destination on the wired network. So it's coming from the client to the server. I put those IP addresses in the name table just to make it easier to read. And I can actually see here the command. Now, I've prepared this file before talking to you. I actually had to decode that text line out. But I can actually see the command. And it says get conta, and there's some numbers. Now, I don't understand all of this Vercollect protocol, but I know that's the command it was sending. I don't need to really know everything it was saying to troubleshoot it, but I can see the command itself. Okay, so that is, they're basically, that's the number they were having a problem at, because I wrote that down. So he said 4147, and he was not getting a response back. So it's basically sending a number to the application server. So I want to see these commands in, so I'm just going to say add as a decode column. That's going to be useful. Now, I'll just zoom out and bring that into a sensible place so we can see it. The other thing I want to do is I want to colour like I did before. So if I go view colour by source, I can see these are all being sent by the client. So the AP is sending, the client is sending its command. And it tries it, and then it retries, doesn't get an ACK back. Retry, no ACK, retry, no ACK, retry, no ACK. And can you see how often this is happening? This is a really per RF environment. We have got multiple retries. That is a lot of retries. Then there's a gap. That's not the same. And then there's the command again. One thing I might want to know is, is to know what sort of time difference is going on, because this is a timing issue, so time columns are really important. So delta time, let me bring that over, that is the time between packets. So I can see these retries are happening incredibly quickly. Let's just zoom in on that. That's it in seconds, so 0.01 seconds between some of these retries. So literally it's trying, it's not getting a response, I'll try again, I'll try again, I'll try again. Now, when I was with the client, the delay was a number of seconds. And these retries are happening in fractions of milliseconds. Okay, so what I want to know is, where are all these seconds going? Well, let's have a... So can I see something about, well, how long has it taken from the first attempt to the last one? Well, I can have a look at that as well. And the way we're going to look at that is not with the delta time, but something called absolute time. Sorry, something called... Not absolute time. I'll turn off absolute time, because that's not as important at the moment. Something called relative time, which is a column I haven't got on. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the very first time the client sends that command. Okay? So let's go back to its very first attempt, which was here. The one that wasn't a retry. And we're going to say right-click and set relative packet. Now, all the times tell me how long things occurred after this first packet. So if I scroll down here, all these retries, 0.05 seconds it took to do all those retries. So fairly fast, but it still didn't get a response. Then what we actually see is an ACK finish, which I don't know if anybody knows what that means. That's it basically saying, I'm pretty much giving up, I'm just acknowledging it. Now, that's actually part of what's also good to see here when we turn on is there's a couple of other columns I want to turn on for you. IP ID and flow ID. Now, the flow ID tells me which TCP session I'm within, and you can see that that one is 309, but this conversation is 310. So you might be, if you didn't have the flow ID on, you might go, oh, well, that finish means it's finishing its TCP conversation, but it isn't. It's actually finishing another TCP conversation. So we can almost, in terms of this conversation, we can almost ignore that packet. That's for another TCP conversation it's having, which is packets for further above in its trace file. Okay, so that's one of the first things to look at. The other thing is looking at where's our IP identifier? Here we go. All of these retries here that we're seeing, and I'll move this along so you can see it with the message and we're not having to scroll as much, are all the same IP identifier. Any IP host, for every IP packet it transmits, it increases its IP identifier by 1. So if I'm a machine and I send out an IP packet, I will give it, say, IP ID 1. The next IP packet, regardless of which conversation, it could be to another device, IP identifier 2. The next IP packet 3, 4. Every IP packet that leaves my IP stack gets and it increases the ID by 1. Okay, so all these retries are obviously the same packet, just as a MAC, at the sort of MAC level, I'm just retransmitting. So they all have the same IP ID. Then there is a gap. If we look at its relative time, there is 0.2 seconds. They all happen in 0.05 seconds. I then, in 0.2 seconds, so 2 tenths of a second, I then send the packet again. But if we look this time, it's got a different IP ID, 6285. So this is a TCP retransmission. This is, I've tried to send the packet once, it's tried to from a Wi-Fi MAC layer point of view, it's tried to retransmit it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's never got there, never got an ACK. Now my TCP stack is kicking in and going, oh, I'm going to send I've never had a TCP ACK back, so I'm going to send a TCP retransmission. And it's done that 0.2 seconds after sending the first one. So it's sent the same command again, but it's a new frame. Now this time, what we're going to see is there's a whole load of other transmissions going on with this conversation 309, which is unhelpful, all stuck in the middle. But the next time we see 310, the next packet up this flow, and I could just, one thing you can do is if you want to get rid of the other flows, you can right click and you can say select packets by flow, and you'll just see just that one TCP flow, the one we're looking at. So if I did that and I went copy to a new window, it'll copy just that flow out that we were looking at. Now now we can see the next thing after this retransmission, which happens 0.2 seconds, we then get a response back. And this is now 2 seconds after the original packet that was sent. So 2 seconds after the original packet, I get a response. And you might go, that's quite a long time, isn't it? One reason, just scroll down, pass all these retransmissions. There it is. So 2 seconds after the command, we get one. And now we're 3 seconds after the original transmission that we've set the relevant packet on, which is why I want to go back to that one. And then what do we see? Well, we see another retry, and another retry. Now, if we look at this, these little plus tells us that these first 3 are Wi-Fi retransmissions, but this final one, the IP identifier was changed. So this is now the server doing a TCP retransmission. And it's actually only when we get this final one that we actually get an ACK back. I've actually got the ACKs filtered out here, which is a shame. I should have shown you that as well, but it's just trying to keep as much as we can now. But we eventually get an ACK back. We are now 9.2 seconds after the original request went out. So what do we make of all of this? Now you could say, well, it's a really rubbish RF environment. And that would account to why he had a 9-second delay. It beeped for 9 seconds and eventually got the response back. You could say it's a really rubbish RF environment, which it is. How many Wi-Fi retransmissions did we have? We had the original message got retransmitted so many times it caused a TCP retransmission, and when we were trying to get the message back, it was retransmitted 3 times, and then it did a TCP retransmission. Eventually we acknowledged it. So the RF environment is poor. However, where's the big delay? The big delay is between this first packet, which never got delivered, and here there's 6 seconds between the TCP retransmission from the server. So actually all the wireless retransmissions happened quite fast, but we were waiting for that retry because the RF environment was poor. We were relying on TCP retries. I wonder why it's slow. So I think we know half the story, but not the whole story. So let's have a look at this same trace file from the wired side, looking at everything to and from the server. So this was literally a mirrored port on the application server. And we'll have a look at what the application server saw. Does it match up to what we saw on the wireless? So again, let me go to the packet of interest. Make sure I've got the right. Yeah, it's around here. So what we're going to do again is we're just going to come in here and we're going to turn on I just need to get the right frame. We're just going to turn on that as a column so we can see the messages again. So here's the messages that we see. And we'll turn on our timing columns as well. So we have got delta time, there we go. Okay. Just going to find a bit of interest here. Here we are. So what do we see on the wired side? So here's the original request that matches the wireless side. So if we quickly look back at the wireless side, you can see the original request here. We can see it's got this protocol, and the 4147 was a request, 4147. So we can see that the original request comes in. Now this is the one we saw retransmitted lots and lots of times, okay? And we never got an ACK back, did we? But do you know what's interesting? We actually saw it get to the application server, which means the AP received it, sent an ACK back, but the client never received the ACK. So actually, where was the problem on the wireless? The problem was not that the AP was never ACKing the frame. The AP received it, forwarded it on, acknowledged it, but the client never got the ACK back. So it just felt like it had to keep retransmitting. So here we had a problem where the client couldn't hear the AP. It was actually being acknowledged because it's sent the frame on to the application server. And the application server has responded. And it responds in 0.04 seconds, pretty quick. But we never received that as a client because we just kept retransmitting the first frame, which we didn't even get a TCP, an ACK back from. And we know what happened eventually. What did the client do? It kept transmitting it, and eventually we got a bit of a gap, and then the TCP retransmission, it sent it again, because it never thought it sent the first one. So here it is again, and we see the next time. And we are at, I think on the wireless trace file, we saw it took about 0.29 seconds. It's actually 0.039 by the time it's got to the application server between the original. In fact, if I make this my, let's make this my set relative packet again. So we can see it's since the relative packet, about 0.29, it's sending, which was, it sends the TCP retransmission. So from an AP, it's retransmitted quite fast. But as an application server, what's happened? It's received a message, it's responded, here's the response, and now it's got the message again. It's a bit odd, isn't it? And the application server is a bit of a state machine. It thinks it's already responded to it. That's not what it's expecting. So it now takes it 3 more seconds before it sends the next response again. The first time it received it, it was able to respond in 0.04 seconds. This time it's taken it a full 3 seconds because as far as it's concerned, it's already sent that one and it's waiting for the next message. It wasn't expecting the same response again. And it's confused the state machine in the application. Yes?
Shouldn't the TCP layer identify that it's a retransmission and not actually forwarding again?
Well, no, because so this is a TCP retransmission, yeah. But in the fact that it's not got a TCP, it never got a TCP ACK to its response it gave. So this one was never ACKed. So therefore, it knows it needs to process it again, but it just takes it time.
But the switch shouldn't send it to the application server twice, because the TCP layer should identify that it has already been sent to the application server once, I would imagine.
Yeah, but from a TCP point of view, if I send data and I don't receive a TCP ACK, I have to retransmit it eventually. And the response never got acknowledged by the client because the client never received it.
Sure. Okay.
So this packet here, although it's retransmitting that, it's taking it time to retransmit it. Because if you don't receive a TCP ACK, you retransmit the data eventually. And it's not received a TCP ACK for that packet, which is important bit. It does receive an ACK for it down here, but by this time it's not done it. And this is what's interesting about this trace file, is when it retransmits it, it takes it 3.1 seconds. And that's also a frame which we know the client never responded to. And then it does a TCP retransmission, which happens at a TCP layer. And we can see that by looking at the sequence numbers, that is a retransmission. And you are right that this is the same sequence number as this one, so it's the same packet, it's just retransmitting from a TCP. But a second retransmission comes 9.2 seconds after that original thing. It actually takes 6.1 seconds for it to do a TCP retransmission. So where was most of the delay? Most of the delay was the amount of time it was taking the application server to realise, I'm not at the TCP acknowledgement, I need to retransmit it. Now, we're getting to the point where we needed to do lots of retransmissions because we had a crummy Wi-Fi RF environment. But the delay was actually happening on the application server, being slow at doing TCP retransmissions. So it's an interesting problem, this, because who's at fault? If you had a really stable RF environment, this application server responds really fast and you never see any problems. But when you have a crummy RF environment, it exposes an issue in the TCP stack in the application server that is really slow to send TCP retransmissions. The Wi-Fi client, on contrast, it does TCP retransmissions in 0.29 seconds. If it doesn't get an ACK back, 0.2 seconds, it's sending a retransmission. It's doing what we call fast TCP retransmission. The application server is really slow. So, you know, you could fix the server and make it so it could cope with a crummy RF environment, or you could try and fix the RF to compensate for the fact that the application server doesn't really like having to be forced into retransmitting data.
So did they fix both, or just the RF, or just the application server?
Well, yeah, we ended up fixing the RF because that's what I could fix. The application server team wouldn't accept there was a problem with our application. So it's never their problem, is it? They checked the logs and it looked okay on the logs. That's what they tell me. We checked the logs and it looks like our application's performing fine. Thanks. Thanks for your report and explaining all of this and putting packet trace files and decodes, but actually our application's okay, they tell me.
By the way, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yes.
Perfect. So, so that was what we discovered with that trace file. That was pretty much going to be one of the last things I showed, but I'm happy to carry on and show you some more stuff if you're interested.
Questions?
Or if there's any questions.
Yeah, on this one, where did you find out that it's the crummy RF environment that's like...
Well, so the RF environment was just that there was lots and lots of retransmissions, and the clients, what was happening was the clients were not hearing the APs much. So it was actually, it was due to the RF environment not being tuned for those clients. And you see this quite often. So actually the client was a pretty rubbish client, to be honest. And it's a client that you wear on a belt. And then if you imagine there's lots and lots of metal cages which they push around. So very often there's a metal cage here and they'll be stood, and this will be the belt, there will be a metal cage, there'll be one in front of them, and then they're trying to get this thing to work. So the way that client sees the RF signals was much, much lower than, say, a laptop would, or even my analyzer, because I was seeing all those a lot of the packets which it wasn't capturing. In fact, I was seeing, so if you look at the whole wireless trace file, I'll show you a filtered one, I was seeing a lot of the acknowledgements from the AP that it wasn't seeing. So I could see acknowledgement, and it could retrying it, because it just wasn't a very good RF client. And it's really important when you design RF that you design it for the clients that you're getting, not just what looks like a good RF design. So another client that I've come across a lot is a wireless printer, 2.4 gigahertz only. And I had a store who had these printers, and the vendor had gone in and done the Wi-Fi design. I'm not going to tell you what wireless vendor it was. But the vendor had gone in under the wireless design, and they'd done, I would say they'd done a terrible design, but if it was designed for an office environment, it was a really good design. You know, if you looked at it, if you did an ACCA confirmation survey with your sidekick, all would be green. All would be good. The problem is these printers have really, really lousy receivers. If you talk about your least capable device, you would definitely be this printer. And I've read with them a lot of time. They see signals about about 18 dB less than my laptop. About 8 dB less than an iPhone. That's how they view the Wi-Fi. So if you're getting, you know, a neg 65 on your laptop, they will be seeing like neg 80 or neg 82, 83.
So where's the skip?
Well, you could say that, but these printers actually can work at really low. They don't need a lot of data, and they're actually quite good. They're 2.4 only, so they need a lot of coverage. Now, the people designing this network hadn't realised that that was the most critical device. Because the other device was a barcode scanner, and a barcode scanner links to the printer. So you pick up a scanner and a printer, and there's a barcode on the scanner, on the printer, and you scan it, and that links them. So then when you're scanning products, it prints labels out. Now, the scanners they had were TC70s, which are 5 gig capable, and they were on the 5 gig, and they worked fine, they roamed really well. But if they lost connection to the printer, the application errored on the scanner and went, error. Lost connection to printer, and you couldn't do anything, because the printer dropped up the wireless network. So the store identified the scanners as their most important device, but their least capable was the printer, and there was a link between the two. So what we ended up doing is I had to go in, and what I ended up having to do was basically increase the 2.4 gig coverage on the radios, and I probably increased them by about 6 dB. So 100 times the power. Now, if you then did a survey of how it looks after I've changed the power, you would go, that looks horrible, Peter, you've got so much co-channel interference, you know, but for these printers to work, that's what they needed. They needed a really, really strong 2.4 gig coverage, and to roam well, because the other thing that someone had identified was, hey, those printers don't roam, and they do, but they just need a really strong secondary signal as well. And if you give it really strong coverage, they actually roamed fine. And then the 5 gigs nicely designed for the scanners, 2.4 designed for the printers, and the system worked really well. But it's about designing for the client. And what had happened was they'd just gone in and designed for what's good RF principles, whatever that means. You know, and let's minimize co-channel interference and not have... But the thing is, they hadn't designed for those printers. And then those printers just didn't work at all on that network. So we always design for the clients. And if it's a really bad client like these things were, and its network just in its warehouse wasn't designed, then it was causing all those retries. So always design for your client. Any other questions? No.
So, since we have you here,
Yes.
Anybody up for 10 more minutes? Good stuff. What's the quirkiest ever situation? What's the hairiest situation you've ever encountered in Wi-Fi? I know, like
Yeah.
this isn't scripted, so,
No,
so
no.
I've never asked you this, but tell a story like really hairy, really
So-
quirky.
The quirkiest and most hairiest one, I think, is probably... There was another distribution centre, interestingly enough, and the way they described the problem for me is they had some new devices they were introducing into the wireless network. They had 200 of them. There were actually some of these voice pickers, actually, that I've mentioned before, but an early model. They were called T5s, Talkman T5s. And this was a really busy, it was what they call an international distribution centre. So it's where all the products initially went and then went out to the distribution centres. And they brought these new devices, and they said when they turned them on and connected them to the Wi-Fi, they got to just about, didn't need to be using them, just got to about 90 turned on, and the entire wireless network came to a sensor. The entire wireless network, nothing worked. Just with them turning them on. He said they can still be in their docks. We turn them on, nothing happens. Everything stops. So I said, okay, so I went to troubleshoot it, and I get there, and we have a meeting, first of all, with them, and I describe what I want to do, and we set a wired capture up, so I've got my wired capture set up, we set some login on some of the devices up, I set all my wireless captures up, we go to the warehouse store where the all these devices are docked but turned off, and I've got my captures running, and I say, okay, let's start turning them on. And the guy next to me went, no, I can't do that. I said, well, what do you mean you can't do that? That's what I'm here to look at. He said, no, I've been told you're not turning any of those devices on until Peter's fixed the issue. And I was like, right. I said, but I can't fix the issue unless I can see it. And they said, but do you not realise how much money it costs for the network to come to a standstill? And I said, no. And then they told me, per minute, how much money it cost them for their operations to stop. And it was a big number. Every minute they're not operating was tens of thousands of pounds it cost them. So we went back to the conference room and we had a phone call with some quite senior people, and after about 2 hours of debating, I managed to convince them to let me reintroduce the problem, but I was given 5 minutes only. And they knew how much that would cost them. And they had basically got approved by senior management that this problem could be introduced for 5 minutes, but 5 minutes only. And I had to basically make sure that in that 5 minutes of time, I capture everything I need to, so I can tell them what the problem with the network was. And it was the most strangest wireless problem I've ever seen, because literally we're sat there capturing it. And if you imagine a really busy distribution centre, this had like several floors, but it was all like mezzanine, so you could see what was going on in the entire warehouse, and there was trucks going zoom, 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 people, and there was all these things operated by Wi-Fi. And as they turned on these devices, slowly, they all came to a standstill. So it's been really, really noisy, literally, because they were waiting for, what's the next thing I need to pick? Not telling them. And literally the entire place went silent. I've never seen anything like that before in my life. Just turning on a bunch of devices and literally the entire network came to a standstill. And I was like, I hope I can fix it. Luckily, I got enough data and was able to, after quite a bit of analysis, work out what the issue was, or at least some of the factors involved, because it was quite a multi-blended issue, that to do with power save and DTIM intervals and devices going off channel scanning and how they informed the AP and how they didn't, and it was a quite complex problem to actually fix, which we did do in the end. But I think that was my strangest, because it was just an entire warehouse coming to a standstill.
So did you end up changing the drivers of the client, firmware of the AP, change the clients entirely? What was the solution?
We changed some of the settings on the Wi-Fi kit, which was DTIM interval. We changed, and a couple of other settings, then low-level settings. But we also got these devices we were turning on. We got the handheld vendors to actually put a new profile on them, so they behaved differently as well in how they did off-channel scanning, because they were basically telling the AP to not send any data, and that was part of the issue. Well, they were going to sleep or going off-channel scanning, and they were effectively crippling the APs well, they didn't need to, but the way the AP was interpreting their packets, they said there was a big argument between were they saying the wrong thing to the AP, or was the AP interpreting it wrong? Of course, both vendors believed what they were doing was right, but we just had to come up with a solution. So we made a few tweaks on the AP vendors, and we pushed a new profile to the clients.
So the last lesson of the day: what is DTIM, and how can it affect your Wi-Fi?
Yeah, DTIM is something known as the delivery traffic indication map, and it is part of, in every beacon frame there is something called a TIM, traffic indication map, which is used for power save. Now, when a client goes to sleep, which is using power save mechanisms, they tend to go to sleep and wake up and listen to beacon frames. And in the TIM, it says, hey, I've got traffic buffered for you, because when a station's sleeping, an access point can't send traffic to that AP, it's got to buffer it. And then it says in the beacon, hey, association ID 10, I've got traffic buffered for you. You wake up, you can stay awake, and you can get your traffic from the AP. That works really well. But what about broadcast and multicast traffic? If I've got one client sleeping and I'm an access point, I've got to buffer all broadcast and multicast traffic. So I can't broadcast it out because that client won't hear it. So I buffer it and I transmit it following what we call a DTIM. And every so many TIMs, every so many beacon intervals, there's something called a DTIM. Every so many TIMs is a delivery traffic indication map. And I will transmit my broadcast and multicast traffic following every DTIM. So that's what it basically means. It's a period of time until I will transmit broadcast and multicast. Now, why is it important? Well, because stations that are sleeping have to wake up at least every DTIM to say, is any broadcast and multicast traffic that I need to stay awake and listen to? So what it does is it dictates when a station will wake up and when it won't wake up. Regardless of when the station wants to wake up and sleep. They specify that as something called a listen interval. That's another story. But DTIM often controls how often it wakes up. And I think a good example of that describes the issues with DTIMs is nowadays a lot of DTIMs are 2 or 3 because we're putting voice traffic and we don't want to sleep for long. But that wasn't always the case. If you go back 8 years, Motorola used to have a default DTIM of 10. What did Motorola make? As well as wireless APs, they made barcode scanners and handheld scanners that need to transmit beep, a little bit of data every now and again, and then they're in the holster, on the belt. They're not active a lot of the time. Cisco, on the other hand, had a default DTIM of 3. Why? Well, Cisco saw Wi-Fi as an extension of the wired LAN. People on laptops, in offices, doing email and accessing files on file drives and the internet, and you want to transmit quite a high volume of data being transmitted, you don't want to sleep for a long time, because it's going to affect your throughput if you sleep too much. So a shorter DTIM. Makes sense for the applications. But then what happens when you take a Motorola scanner, but you put it on a Cisco infrastructure? Well, this happened at the time I was doing some training for Motorola, and their SEs asked me to help them with a case. And the case was it sold, I think it was, I can't remember, it was something like 10,000 handhelds to a customer. And the customer wanted to return all 10,000 handhelds because on the spec sheet it said that the battery would last 10 hours. And they had 8-hour shifts and it was only lasting 6 hours. And they said if it doesn't last a shift, they're useless to us. We need them to last at least a shift. You've said 10 hours, it's only lasting 6. But what the issue was they'd been put on a Cisco infrastructure with a default DTIM of 3. So now these clients were waking up every 3rd beacon instead of every 10, and it affected the battery life of the client so much so that you only get in, instead of the 10 hours advertised, which was with a 10 DTIM, you actually only get in 5 hours, 5 to 6 hours, and it wasn't lasting the 8-hour shift. We modified the DTIM on the Cisco infrastructure, and they got the 10-hour battery again out of the clients. So DTIM's an important setting, especially when you're looking at things like battery life.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So, and that would lead us to an interesting debate of like the difference. Well, why do you need target wake time then if you have DTIM? So stay tuned for the next episode of Wi-Fi for that. But at this point, I think we're running out of time. They're gonna kick us out of the room. So a huge round of applause to Peter MacKenzie first.
Thank you.